Hello, everybody. Welcome to Live with Sara and Tasha, your weekly Find the Joy moment. I know that it is definitely ours. I am Sarah Hodson, the founder and CEO here at Live Well, joined on the week of our 10th anniversary by my best friend and person who has been there with me for 10 years.
Tasha McCrae. Hello, everyone. I'm our VP of Brand and Culture here at Live Well. Thank you for that kind introduction, Sarah.
I hear Jester in the background. Is he upset that I said that you're my best friend and he's feeling quite left out of our friendship?
I am her best friend. What are you talking about? Yes,
well, Jester, we'll have a conversation when I see you next.
Jester, for those of you who have not met him before, is my geriatric Boston Terrier crossed with a pug. He's a bug. And he accompanies me here as in the office.
That's so cute. I remember when you first actually got him, and he was a bundle of energy. And we will definitely say he's not best friends with the mailman, because that's been a little bit of an obstacle over the years. But so anyways, sorry, moving on.
So Sarah and I are just thrilled that you've decided to join us today. We host these calls just to share our passion for the power of exercise and behavior change to help you live your life to the very fullest it can be.
And of course, we love this opportunity to, on a weekly basis, connect with all of you, see your faces, be able to engage with our Live Well family from across Canada. So just a friendly reminder that if you can see your face on the screen, it means that we can all see your face, which we absolutely love. If you're not comfortable, feel free to turn your camera off though, and just, participate, spectate, be a viewer. But if you do feel comfortable, feel free to open up those cameras because we do love to see your faces.
And here through the power of Zoom, there's absolutely nothing wrong. If you want to, when you turn your camera on, if you need to fluff and fold your hair or do whatever, it's all good. We understand. You've got a mirror in front of you. If you want to join in the conversation today, please use the chat function. It is open. We do have everybody muted just so that we get a nice clear recording for our audio, but you can join the conversation by just clicking into that chat button, and Sarah and I will be able to see your comments and touch base with you on them from there. So, without further ado, let's get started. Today, we wanted to talk about understanding blood sugars. And blood sugars, of course, everybody thinks about diabetes when we talk about blood sugars, and they are a huge piece of a diagnosis of diabetes. But blood sugars are actually something for all of us to be thinking about and concerned about, and paying attention to in our own lives, whether or not we have a diagnosis of diabetes. So blood sugars, first of all, are not a bad thing. Blood sugars are vitally important for keeping us alive.
True.
Sugar, though it's gotten a connotation as sort of a bad thing, sugar is the primary fuel source for your body, or glucose being one of the primary fuel sources of the body. And in fact, one of the only fuel sources that our brain can use. So sugars in our blood are not bad. What is a problem is that when we have too much sugar in our blood, and that's when these elevated blood sugars can be a precursor for a diagnosis of diabetes. And if you aren't aware, diabetes is so concerning because it is a major risk factor for heart disease and stroke, which is the #1 killer in North American society. So definitely we want to be aware and controlling our risk for diabetes. So people with diabetes actually have a 2 to 4 times more, a higher risk of having heart disease and stroke. So it's a pretty significant risk factor. And controlling our blood sugars is a really important step in reducing the damage that blood sugars or elevated blood sugars can do. So, when we talked about blood pressure a few weeks back, we talked about mechanical stress. And I always like to show the inside of a blood vessel looking like this. And mechanical stress of blood pressure is that outward push on the outside of our vessels. Blood sugars are a little bit different in that it's a chemical stress. So, as our blood becomes a little bit more syrupy, a little bit more sweet, that sugar can irritate the inside of our lining. And then that leads to sort of a cascade of inflammatory effects as our body tries to repair the endothelium or the inside of our blood vessel. And that repair process that our body is trying to protect us with is actually the beginning of atherosclerotic plaques. So that's how diabetes and heart disease are so closely linked. That chemical stress damages the lining of our arteries, and then we get that inflammation that starts to try to repair the artery, and eventually those plaques build up. And it happens in vessels all over the body, not just the vessels of the heart. So you might have heard diabetes being linked to kidney problems, eye problems, nerve problems. All of those small vessels that are in our eyes, kidneys, and around our nerves are all affected by having too much sugar. So that's why we care about our blood sugar levels, why your doctors might be testing them regularly, regardless of whether you have diabetes.
And something that, for Tasha and I specifically, I think back, over 10 years ago, when probably 15, 16 years ago, when Tasha and I were working together in cardiac rehab, we specifically, worked with primarily heart patients after they'd had heart bypass surgery or some type of heart intervention, stents or so forth. And we had, a group of our patients had diabetes. And as Tasha and I would be talking about diabetes, and we actually ran a diabetes education program for people who had diabetes who weren't participating in our cardiac rehab exercise program, but could come in and get some education from us. And so Tash and I became really passionate about this topic because we also knew that there is less access for people with diabetes to the type of exercise programs and lifestyle change information and support that cardiac rehab had. And it was through that Tash and I really started to advocate for people with diabetes to be included in exercise programming and to have the same supports, because just as Tasha was explaining, there's such a link between diabetes and heart disease. And in fact, we know that 85% of people with diabetes actually die of heart disease. And so this is a really strong connection that I think we have to be aware of. And Tasha, I love, and Tasha gives the example of the mechanical and the chemical stress and how those things really come together and start to lay the foundation for atherosclerosis and for heart disease to start to build. I have the pleasure, I think twice a year now, in April and November, to teach the section of physical activity for the Diabetes Canada course that is offered to nurses and pharmacists so that they can become diabetes educators. And I do the component on physical activity and exercise. And, it's a really, it's an exciting topic for both Tash and I to talk about, because we've worked with patients before and really advocated. And one of our huge even reasons and founding reasons for Live Well, which, if you didn't hear me mention earlier, started 10 years ago this week. We offered our first exercise sessions. One of our huge contributing reasons for starting Live Well was because we identified that there was many populations of people who had health concerns who were not being served in fitness and in health and in comfortable environments that were led by healthcare professionals. And so I do think that this is an important topic. And as we move more into talking, I'll even share some of the things that I share as I teach the diabetes educator course, and just some of the really fun ways I think that we can look at our blood sugars and blood glucose. But first of all, let's kind of talk about what causes high blood sugar. So, we have to have blood sugars, right? We have to have sugar in our blood, as Tasha mentioned. That glucose molecule is vital to our existence. And so I think that, many of us are probably aware that there's both a genetics and a lifestyle play that comes in the development of our high blood sugars. And they can also rise due to the types of foods that we eat.
And
So,
Sarah, before we charge on, we should probably say, when we're talking about using diabetes, there are different types of diabetes. And primarily, sort of what we're talking about today is type 2 diabetes. So diabetes that can be influenced by lifestyle, where type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease where the cells of your pancreas stop working. So when we're talking about lifestyle interventions today, please be aware that it is type 2 diabetes, though exercise also important for type 1 diabetes and helping manage things. But when we're just like to make that distinction between type 1 and type 2.
yeah, really great. And as we go on, you'll also start to hear us talk about something called pre-diabetes, which some of you may have heard before, but we'll get into that in a moment. So yes, specifically looking at type 2, we have this kind of lifestyle and genetic component. So we were talking about kind of, yes, our blood sugars can also rise due to the foods that we eat. And so over time, a diet that is high in things like refined carbohydrates and sugars can actually lead to an increased risk of elevated blood sugars in the cells of the pancreas. And so the pancreas starts to tire with diabetes, and the cells actually become a little bit more resistant to insulin. And even when we are looking at the treatment for diabetes, sometimes we hear our members, and specifically Tash and I have had some great experiences working with physicians who really have focused on diabetes care, looking at, okay, well, there's a lot that I'm going to do, and I'm going to try to kind of push off treatment and try to make my blood sugars better. But there's a lot of research to show that early intervention and treatment is actually very helpful, specifically because around this topic of our pancreatic cells are tiring out. And we want to remove the load and the fatigue from those cells as early as possible in order to not have the disease advance at a pace that is faster than what we would hope. Diabetes is a progressive disease. Again, the fatigue continues of those pancreatic cells. So it is all about us managing and kind of holding it at bay at whatever stage we're at. But diet is not the only culprit. Tash, I feel like you had something meaningful to say.
Okay, you continue on. I'll pipe in with my 2 cents in a second.
Okay. I love it. But diet is not the only culprit. Obviously, some people have a family history of diabetes, and so they're more prone, as well as there are certain ethnic groups. And we also know some other contributing factors are things like excess weight, and we're going to talk about that in a bit, specifically abdominal fat distribution and, no surprise, inactivity. So Tasha, I'll let you pipe in because I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, you heard Sarah use the word insulin sensitivity, and in those pancreatic cells being sensitive to insulin. So a really quick biology lesson here. When our blood sugars rise because we have eaten not necessarily sugar, but some sort of carbohydrate. And remember that carbohydrates are found in fruits, vegetables, grains. They're found in all sorts of different foods, some of them healthier than others. But we can talk about that in a bit as well. But as those blood sugars rise, the body, being intuitive and smart, goes, hey, I got to keep this level under control for the health. So it sends out insulin into your system. And insulin's job, I kind of like to envision insulin like Pac-Man. It goes around and kind of gobbles up the sugar and shuttles it into cells. And cells might be in the muscle, it might be in the liver, and those can act kind of like parking lots for our sugar. If we don't need them immediately, we can park them in the liver, park them in the muscle. And if we run out of room, we have overflow parking in the fat cell. And the fat cell will gladly take on that sugar and store it as fat for us so that we can use it later when we need it. So again, the body's a really efficient system. It doesn't want to waste any of this beautiful energy we're giving it. So it sends it off, if we don't need it, into these different parking lots so that we can use them later. If we always have high blood sugars, what happens is our cells get a little bit less responsive to insulin. So they don't accept it as well. Another great analogy I've heard, it's like a broken doorbell. The pizza delivery guy, insulin, he's there and he's ringing, but nobody's answering the door because the doorbell's broken because it's gotten hit a few too many times. I always thought that was a good analogy as well. So as those blood sugars are chronically elevated, our body at first does a really good job of handling them. And I was talking to somebody just the other day who was saying, well, my blood sugars are actually really good, despite the fact that I have a relatively high carbohydrate. They were talking about some foods that they were trying to get rid of in their diet that, would be sort of seen as less favorable. But my blood sugars are great. And that just means that your insulin is doing its job. And for now, those pancreas cells are keeping up. But as they get more tired and sluggish, that's when we start to see people's blood sugar start to creep up. And so just because right now your blood sugars are looking good, it doesn't mean that there's not high insulin levels running in the background to deal with high blood sugars if you are having a very high refined carbohydrate diet. Does that make sense to everyone? This call will be 3 hours because I love talking about this. No, I'm
I was
just
going to
joking.
say, you're such a good educator on this.
We won't keep you here 3 hours, but I could talk about it for that long.
How many people want to be here for 3 hours?
Oh, I got one hand. All right, Julie, it's me and you. I love it. Okay.
Okay. So Tash, do you want to maybe just share with us a little bit now that you kind of explained that? How do we know when we're moving into an issue with our blood sugars? Like, how do we know when our healthy blood glucose has moved to an unhealthy, concerning blood glucose?
Yeah. So our doctors will be testing our blood sugars, and in Canada, it's recommended that, usually around the age of 40, your doctor should start checking your blood sugars at a regular interval. So if you haven't had your sugars checked in 5 years, it might be time just to touch base with the doctor and just make sure as part of your routine sort of blood work. But there's really two different measures that you could see showing up on a lab test that would help direct you here. And one of them is your fasting blood sugar or your fasting blood glucose. So sometimes you'll see FBG. Is that abbreviation? And that's a test that's measuring an overnight fast of at least 8 hours and just seeing how your blood sugars are doing when you don't really have any food in your system. And when you get a measurement of between 6.1 and 6.9 millimoles per liter, please note that if you're reading something on the internet and it's from an American source, that they do use a different measure, and therefore the numbers look very different than the Canadian numbers. So 6.1 to 6.9 is that impaired fasting glucose. So your body, it might be struggling a little bit. And that's the area where Sara said the doctor may say you don't have diabetes, but you have pre-diabetes. And what we know is that pre-diabetes does carry a consequence because still there's a little bit too much sugar. So you don't have a diagnosis, but you still do have some additional sugar irritating the cells. So it's not without consequence. It is still something you want to get on top of. If your blood sugar, fasting blood sugar is over 7 millimoles per liter, that's actually you can be diagnosed with diabetes. Though often they'll take two measures before they'll give you that diagnosis. The other measure that you're going to see is something called your hemoglobin A1C. And that's a test that measures your average blood sugars over the last 90 days. And hemoglobin, you might think of a red blood cell, and red blood cells sort of get sort of sugar will attach to it. They call it glycated hemoglobin. And we can see over the course of a lifespan of a blood cell how much sugar is sticking to it. And then we can measure that percentage and figure out on average how your blood sugars are doing. So an A1C of 6 to 6.4, and that's a percentage, 6 to 6.4% would be prediabetes, and anything over 6.5 on two separate occasions would be diabetes. If you are already diagnosed with diabetes, you're probably very familiar with your A1C, and the target should be below 7 if you already have a diagnosis. And Sara, I think when we first started, now we're getting to be, we'll call it seasoned in our profession. I think that the cutoff was 7 even for a diagnosis. So we are seeing it creep down a little bit as they find a little bit more research on how important it is for us to get on our blood sugar management early in the disease process.
Exactly. And how much that, again, preventative treatment, even at the level of pre-diabetes, is really important. And actually, a lot of the different treatment options do have a really strong cardiovascular protective component. And so sometimes we think of a medication as kind of in its own silos, like this type of a medication only treats my diabetes, but in many ways, the physiology or the chemistry of how that pharmaceutical medication impacts your body has other benefits, and as we know, often also has some downsides. But when we look at many diabetes medications, there is a cardiovascular protection built in there, so to reduce the risk of heart attack and stroke. So back again to earlier what Tasha was saying, a really close tie there, an important aspect of our diabetes care, or even just our blood sugar management. So let's talk about some ways that we can actually manage our blood sugars. Of course, there's our diet, the foods that we're eating. There is weight loss is shown to be effective, and of course, exercise. And so when we look at managing our blood sugars, specifically, yes, the foods that we eat can have an impact. So eating a diet full of fiber. So fiber is something that kind of slows the release of carbohydrates. And so For example, when we look at an apple in its whole form as a fruit has both fiber and carbohydrates. What's that little saying that you say, Tasha, that
when God created the poison, he packaged it with the antidote. I can't take credit for that. That was an endocrinologist who I heard say it. Maybe he stole it from someone else. But again, an apple has lots of sugar, right? Fruit sugars naturally occurring. If I juiced that apple, it would be a direct hit of sugar right through to my system, and my blood sugars would rocket up relatively quickly. But the fiber in that apple, if I eat it in its whole form, will slow down that rise in sugar so it doesn't peak as high, and spread out that sugar over a time frame, which will allow less insulin to be able to deal with the glycemic load.
Yeah, so I love that, and a great, again, the more fiber that we have, the more that it kind of slows down that peaking of our carbohydrates and our blood glucose. So lean protein sources, and obviously limiting our refined carbohydrates and sweets. Those are some high level ways that we can kind of create a healthy diet that would help to manage our blood sugars. And then let's talk about exercise. Specifically when I teach this Diabetes Canada course, I talk about how our bodies and how the movement of our bodies is really the OG, the original kind of treatment and management of our blood sugars, because truly our bodies moving is such a precise yet complex yet almost instant way for our body to manage our blood sugars. We were made to move, and our bodies alone were meant to manage our blood sugars in the absence of diabetes. Now, in the presence of pre-diabetes or diabetes, we want to use it to, again, manage our diabetes and to slow down the progression of the disease. And so exercise, you may have heard, has what we call like an insulin-like effect. So if you think of our muscles as a sponge, and as we're working our muscles kind of allow our muscles soak up the blood sugars like a sponge, right? So our muscles are, in Tasha's analogy of the pizza boy at the door ringing the doorbell, our muscles are the people just opening the doors and letting all the pizza boys in. And kind of, even though the doorbell wasn't working, we start exercising and doors start opening in our body to allow that blood glucose to ultimately be kind of soaked up, right? And so the beauty, again, in movement is that moving our bodies, physical activity, going for a walk, exercising, actually lowers our blood sugars for within about 10 minutes of movement for up to 24 hours is where we see the most impact. But there's a lot of evidence to even support up to 72 hours after. So knowing that that first 24 hours is where it's most effective. So we go and we exercise, and we're creating a 24-hour management and treatment system in our body. It's pretty unbelievable to think about it that way, right? That means that if we are truly trying to manage our blood sugars through exercise, we should try to exercise every day at about the same time, just as we would take a medication or a prescription. And that's really where we use this term, exercise is medicine, right? You have this ability to exercise at the same time every day to help to manage your blood sugars.
And what's really cool, some of the newer research coming out is looking at how our circadian rhythms and exercise can work together for optimal blood sugar management. And what we're learning is that in the mornings is when our body is, let's say, most responsive to insulin. And so we can better manage higher glycemic loads in the morning. But as the day wears on, our body is less and less able, and not when we're ill, just this is how it is, that we are less and less able to manage blood sugars as well. So if you're somebody who has borderline blood sugars or has a diagnosis of diabetes, using that as a principle, when is the best time for you to exercise? It's probably actually in the afternoon. It might be a walk after dinner, or somewhere around 3 o'clock is a kind of a beautiful window to use the insulin like effect of exercise to boost up your ability to deal with a glycemic load in the evening. And a lot of us, our dinners tend to be relatively heavy in carbohydrates. And so we need that little boost to be able to deal with them. So that's a little timing tip that might be able to help you as well. So, if you're a morning exerciser, but you're really struggling with your exercise, maybe talk to the clinic about, is there any room in the afternoon? Of course, any exercise at any time of day is better than no exercise. But if we're really trying to optimize, if you have blood sugar issues, the afternoon might be better for you.
And some of the impact of exercise, we're kind of talking about it within a day, but what kind of happens as we exercise day by day, week by week, month by month, is that it's no longer just the bout of exercise, that moment of exercise that is actually causing the muscles to soak up the blood sugars. We actually now have a system that's built in that is actually helping to manage blood sugars all the time. It's a little bit more of a permanent foundation that we are building. So as we build those exercise sessions on one another, we are not only benefiting from the bouts, we are actually creating a physiological change in how our body deals with what we would call the insulin pathway, which is really how our body is dealing with the blood glucose. So just so powerful. Again, Tash and I could talk about this for hours, because exercise really is magic when it comes to our blood sugars. There's been global studies to show around our weight that even a decrease in our body weight of 5 to 10% can have a really good impact on improving our glycemic control, improving how we can pull the glucose out of the blood into the muscles. So,
and to Sarah's point there, weight loss can be a challenge, especially for somebody who is on a medication for diabetes, like insulin or something that works to help our body secrete more insulin. Weight loss can be a real challenge. But, don't just rely on exercise and diet. Also rely on your day-to-day activities. Sarah just wrote a great article that's being published in CanFit Pro, which is a group of fitness professionals here in Canada, talking about the non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And that's just that energy that we need just to keep us on our feet and kind of moving around in our day-to-day activities. So I think a really great thing for people who are trying to manage blood sugars is not only to exercise, which is a sort of single bout, but try also to keep moving throughout your day.
yeah, so true. And to end with kind of some good news, as we kind of pull this all together, is that with some careful changes in your lifestyle, and again, really focusing on type 2 diabetes here, and even pre-diabetes, it is possible to prevent, delay, and in some cases, even reverse diabetes. And we've given you some powerful tools and topics today for you to think about and to dig into. So, what are you going to do this week to live well and manage your blood sugars? Well, be kind to your body and your blood sugars this week by kind of avoiding those refined carbohydrate foods. And if you feel like you need a refresher on diet and blood sugars, there is an article titled Carbohydrate Metabolism and Insulin in your health coaching lessons. And of course, try to achieve 150 minutes of exercise, keeping in mind what Tasha and I were talking about. It would be better to have exercise at the same time every day, and even considering that later afternoon or even early evening bout of exercise to help to manage your blood sugars. And of course, plan for the week ahead by setting a weekly practice plan. Go into your member portal and set 1, 2, maybe 3 things that you feel that you can confidently achieve this week. And don't forget to share them with your coaches and your CEPs in the clinic. When we fail to plan, we plan to fail. So we really want to champion your potential to be successful.
Sara, it sounds like you're going to make me close and not stay on for 3 hours. So before we leave, I will remind people, please subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch all of our live episodes. We will be back here next week, same time, same place, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. And next week, we're going to give you a trick for making new habits stick a little easier. We call it habit coupling. So we want to thank all of our members who are joining us live today. If you have any questions about your blood sugars, how exercise is affecting that, please talk to your clinical exercise physiologists in clinic. That Sara and I are the original clinical exercise physiologists and health coaches, but your staff in clinic are just as knowledgeable, and they can help you with any questions that you may have. If you're watching this on a replay and you are not a member, we invite you to come check us out at LiveWell and be a guest in our clinic. You can do that at www.livewellclinic.ca, and we would love to get a chance to meet you. Thank you so much, everyone.
All of you can now go to YouTube and watch 2.5 hours of replays of other topics in order to meet that 3-hour threshold that Tasha got you so invigorated and excited about. Thank you, everyone. We will see you next week, same time, same place.